What if I told you that the reason some watercolor paintings just don't work is that we're focusing too much on color and not enough on texture? After all, everything we see in the real world feels different to human touch, and our eyes can recognize these differences like glossy, smooth, or bumpy, which means we can't always paint them the same way. So in this video, I'm going to reveal my favorite methods for building texture with watercolor that will help you create a sense of realism and add super tactile quality to your work, giving the illusion of different materials and surfaces. And I'm going to show you how you can make your paintings 10 times more interesting with some very simple techniques, even if you're a beginner. What's crazy is that for most of these methods, we don't even need new or expensive supplies. We actually have household products like salt that work wonders with watercolor. But of course, I will also show you some fancy stuff like these so-called super granulating paints. So let's get started. I'm going to sketch out my vegetables based on the reference photo, which I link in the video description below so you can practice on your own time. Because let's be honest, the internet doesn't need another pretty flower tutorial. I'm kidding, of course. I have a massive glowing rose coming your way next week, so don't forget to subscribe if you're into botanicals. And if you want to paint with me in real time and see every stroke, I will post this tutorial on my Patreon channel later this month. And if you're wondering whether I sketch or trace my compositions, I mostly freehand, so I can add lots of additional elements like these butterflies just to make it more exciting. But of course, drawing requires a completely different set of skills, so never feel bad about tracing outlines as long as your reference image is copyright free. And don't forget to always use a hard pencil like 2H or 3H to avoid graffiti marks on your watercolor paper. And the first type of texture I will show you is quite simple. We have these shiny tomatoes in the center, but the highlights are not very defined. There's a little bit of a fuzz on the surface of each sphere, so they're not quite glossy, not reflecting all the sunlight they receive, and they're not perfectly round spheres either, so the highlights are sort of spread out. So as you can see, I cover the surface with light pink, a mixture of my red and water, adding some more saturated pigment around the highlight. Right now there's a defined border between light and color, but I don't want this harsh highlight. I'm going to now drop a bunch of clear water right on top, letting it spread and push the particles of paint in different directions. My tip here is to always have a second jar of clean water handy just for these water drops. I will follow the same process on my second tomato, softening the highlight I leave initially with a bunch of clear water on top. And for the tomato at the bottom, I will actually put a few extra drops in different areas, again creating these very soft highlights with some subtle fuzzy texture around them. These are called water blooms, and they're a great way to create soft highlights on the surface of the object you're painting. This looks interesting visually, but as I said, it's very, very subtle, not enough to create this intricate texture that we have on our broccoli. And this is where we need to use salt. Let me show you how. You may be thinking, salt with your watercolor, what's that all about? It's actually one of the most effective ways to create visual interest in your watercolor work, and you will see in just a minute, it's really, really magical. So first we need to add some base color, and I would go with a combination of greens and blues. Let's say aqua green around the edges, and in the shadow areas, this green is closer to blue on the spectrum and it matches the reference photo nicely, and a little bit of hooker's green on the highlights. The surface of our broccoli is quite bumpy, and I want to use warmer colors in those areas that are catching some sunlight. You can always just add some regular yellow to your main green, so don't get stuck on matching specific pigments I use. It's the overall effect that matters. And you can also add some purples or even violets if you're feeling adventurous or simply love vibrant colors like I do. Just make sure you work quickly so everything stays wet before you bring out the salt shaker, and this is where all the magic happens. I'm going to place my shaker quite close to my paper so I can aim slowly and make sure I drop my salt right into the wet paint. As I'm doing this, I will share 3 things that you need to keep in mind if you want to get the best salt texture. So the first thing is the salt effect is always delayed, so don't overdo it. You only need a few crystals for a beautiful effect. don't rush to leave like a whole spoonful of salt on your paper. Just sprinkle a little bit and let it sit there. Trust the process. Second, don't disturb the salt. You kind of have to resist the temptation to keep working and come back when the surface is dry if you want to add more shadows. I'm being sneaky and trying to add some extra shadows, but this is not good. I'm going to stop for now. Let me take the next 30 minutes and speed it up so you can see the crystals of salt do their magic, pushing the particles of paint out and creating tiny bumps on the surface of my paper. The last tip regarding salt is the sooner you add salt, the stronger the effect will be, meaning each crystal of salt will leave a bigger, more defined mark. I actually wanted the opposite. I wanted smaller cluster-like clouds of crystals to match the smaller bumps on the broccoli. So this is why I allowed my colors to sink in a little bit into the paper while I was working slowly to apply paint on the entire surface of my broccoli, and only then followed with salt. So play around. This is always fun. So you can see how it turned out now, but I'm still letting the broccoli rest just to make sure it's bone dry before I come back. And in the meantime, I want to show you a different, this time a glossy texture effect using nothing but my paints and a sharp pointed round brush. The peppers are wet, as you can see in the reference photo, and I'm painting around small highlights with the tip of my brush. You can see how different this effect is compared to what we just did on tomatoes. Small, very sharp, very defined spots that are not perfectly round, but rather follow the natural curve of the pepper. Every highlight has a very defined, very sharp edge, which is instantly signaling to the eyes that this surface is covered in shiny water droplets. And the pepper itself is quite smooth, so if I left just a continuous white line, it would simply be a smooth, shiny pepper. But because I'm breaking down my line into tiny segments, I'm also capturing the glossy water drops. And also notice that I'm not trying to capture every single shape that I see in the reference photo. I'm not that skilled. My paper is too small, and frankly it's unnecessary. The overall effect is what matters, and I'm simplifying quite a bit. Nevertheless, I'm quite happy with the result, and look, the broccoli is now completely dry. I'm going to gently check the surface with my fingers and then remove the particles of salt with a soft, clean dishcloth. Just like that, the broccoli is almost ready. You can now glaze some subtle shadows on top just to add more dimension, and I'm using my blues and purples here. Or you can leave it as is. I think it looks quite delicious, even with this simple salt texture on its own. Now it's time to bring out the big guns, the super granulating paints, and I have several from Schmincke. I will go with this Tundra shade, and if you've never tried super granulating paints, you are up for a real treat. They will give you hours of fun. It's a whole different world of watercolor paint, quite distinct from normal flowing watercolors that you might be more used to. And you may already be familiar with the general granulation effect, which is quite common for some traditional pigments like ultramarine, for example. Essentially, the granulating effect occurs because certain pigments have larger particle sizes compared to other pigments, and when these larger particles are suspended in the water and applied to paper, they tend to settle into the depressions and irregularities on the paper surface. As the water evaporates, as you can see in my little vegetable composition, the pigments remain in these pockets, forming textured and granular areas. That can be quite nice and subtle with regular paints, but with super granulating pigments, these effects are quite wild. And you can see that the particles here separate almost clearly into two different colors now, the underlying warm orangey color and the heavier, cooler violet. This is a lot of fun. Make sure you prep the surface with a generous amount of water, especially around the edges, so the paint has a lot of room to flow, and let the super granulating pigments do their magic. My main tips for working with granulating paints is to use them on rough or cold pressed paper because it has enough texture for the particles to move. The hot pressed is just way too smooth and it would be a waste of this pigment. Secondly, use gravity to enhance the effects. You can lift your paper or sketchbook and tilt it in different directions. In fact, I'm going to leave this background to dry, standing almost upright. The particles of super granulating paints are so heavy, they will literally move up or down depending on how you position your sheet of paper, and the overall effect can be much stronger. Lastly, these are not cheap, so if you just want to play and experiment once, get a dot chart. I only now, after years of painting with watercolors, have invested in full tubes. For years, I've been using a dot chart of granulating paints from Daniel Smith, and it has some small samples that cost me about $15. I got to try their entire super granulating range and use them in many paintings until I found specific shades that I'm really interested in and ready to invest in. So this is a very unique look. I prefer my granulating textures for background and background objects where I can have some room for abstract effects. And I like to contrast them with more smooth, regular flowing pigments. So I will add those at the bottom and show you the final texture effect, which is commonly known as a watercolor mistake actually. Well, it's not a mistake if you do it on purpose. I'm talking about a backwash. This is the most unpredictable texture effect. I'm still trying to master it, but it's so cool when it works out right. So I cover the entire bottom half of my painting with gold ochre and then follow with Perlin Violet on top. Grab a flat brush full of clean water and put down a stroke right at the border of two colors. What ends up happening is all this fresh water is pushing up against my violet, literally preventing it from flowing down. Instead, it's starting to float up, creating what is known as the backwash. And sometimes these occur spontaneously when we don't plan them, maybe when we overwork large surfaces, adding more and more water and interfering with paint flow. But this time I'm doing it in a very controlled way, and I'm also lifting my paper up to prevent my violet from going all the way up towards the vegetables. At the end, it sort of has nowhere to go. It's being pushed up by clear water from the bottom, and then it's being pushed down by gravity, so it sort of gathers in the strip right at the bottom of my vegetables and stays there to dry. I don't know if you like the final look. It's sort of a jagged shadow at the bottom, but the final result is sort of not the point. The point is to play and to enjoy the process, to see what happens. And I'm quite happy with this play session. What I wanted to show you is that the backwash effect can be used intentionally as a technique to enhance the complexity of your watercolor textures. It adds an element of unpredictability to your artwork because it's quite spontaneous and we have limited control over the exact outcome. But as you can see, the resulting patterns and color interactions can create a whole new sense of movement, maybe a stronger sense of atmosphere or depth in your painting. I was going for a variety for the sake of this video, and a variety is what we have at the end. So let's add some butterflies, of course, in the spirit of being extra. More is more in this case, and of course I will create a somewhat more tame version of this composition for my Patreon subscribers with less crazy background play and just focusing on the veggies, traditional watercolor techniques, and I hope you enjoyed this crazy experiment. If you want to learn more about traditional watercolor techniques like wet on wet and wet on dry, less texture and emphasis on simple, beautiful color transitions, check out this blue orchid tutorial. Thank you for watching and painting with me, and I will see you next week.